So about 14 months ago, I brewed a 10-gallon batch of Saison. I pitched Brett into 5 gallons of it. The beer turned out great, and I think it'll improve even more over time. Well, thanks a lot for stopping by Cascades Homebrew. My name is Brent. So I've been brewing beer for over 30 years. This is my first time using Brett. So I brewed a couple batches using Philly sour. I haven't used any, say, wild yeast or bacteria. And just to be clear, Brettanomyces is not made to produce sour beer. So Brett, or Brettanomyces, it's a type of a yeast. It's not producing sour beers, but it's producing more of these kind of like farmhouse beers, maybe with some funky flavors. So I'm looking at the descriptor of them. Some of them, they don't sound very appealing. Barnyard, fecal, horsey, metallic, band-aid. But what are the other descriptions? Fruity esters, well, that sounds a little more appealing. So personally, I'm not really a huge fan of mixed culture sour beers, but I do like the character, that kind of funky character that Brett can add, especially to a Saison. So for those of you that have watched my videos, you do watch all my videos, right? You know I brewed a 10-gallon batch as a collaboration with my friend Matt from Jagger's Brewing Company. I put out one video about the brew day. That was my first time trying to brew a 10-gallon batch out of my 15-gallon kettle using Brew in the Bag. That video's up on the channel. I also got together with Matt where we did a collaboration tasting, and I put a video together for that one as well. So since I got those videos out about the brew day, this one's going to focus a little bit more just on the Brett and the fermentation. So what Brett did I use? What was my process? And then more importantly, how did the beer turn out? Was it worth all the time and effort to make a Brett beer? So taking a quick look at the recipe for that base Saison, so the grain, 70.2% of a Pilsner malt, 19.6% rye malt, 10.2% of torrefied wheat. The beer was mashed for 60 minutes at 152 degrees Fahrenheit or 66.7 degrees Celsius, boiled for 60 minutes. So at the start of that 60-minute boil, I added 2 ounces of EKG, giving about a little over 16 IBUs. And then at the 5 minutes left in the boil, I added 2 ounces of Saaz, maybe give me, say, about 4 IBUs. Just for scale, remember those hops. That was a 10-gallon batch, so scale it to your batch size if you needed. So looking closer at the fermentation. For primary fermentation, I used Bootleg Biology Saison Parfait. It was my first time using this yeast, but I was pretty happy with the results overall. I made a starter just to ensure I had plenty of healthy yeast to ferment my double-sized batch. Primary fermentation temps were around the sort of typical room temperature. So with the primary fermentation done, it's time to move on to the Brett. So the particular Brett strain I decided to use was WLP 650 Brettanomyces Bruxellensis, often just called Brett Brux. That's a little easier for me to say. Then actually Decara, that actually may be more correct other than Brettanomyces, but we'll just stick with Brett. There are a number of different strains of Brettanomyces from different vendors, so this Brett Brux is kind of a popular one. It seemed like it would be a good choice for my first chance using a Brett. So if you want to take a deep dive into brewing with Brett, well, this is probably not the video. I would recommend you check out the Milk the Funk wiki. They have a great page that talks all kinds of details about Brettanomyces. It's a pretty long page. So I would say some of the most useful sections I found in there, discussion about the ester and phenol production, contains descriptions for all the different flavors that are produced by a Brett, commercial cultures, details just on the many different cultures and strains of Brett that are available. And then there's a section on using Brettanomyces, talking about information about fermenting with Brett, pitch weights, how to make starters and when to make starters. At the bottom, there's also a link to a great article and webinar from Escarpment Laboratories. They're a great resource for yeast information. So according to Milk the Funk, WLP 650 characteristics include barnyard, prominent leathery aroma and flavor, low levels of supporting tropical fruit. So then as far as options for fermenting with Brett, there's several different options you can take. So one option is fermenting 100% with Brett. So basically just pitching Brett into your primary fermentation. So you would think that might give you the best Brett character since that's the only yeast present. Well, according to Milk the Funk, it's really kind of the opposite. They say, if used in the primary fermentation, the beer that's produced is often perceived as fruit forward, but not very funky. So it produces those fruit characters, but not kind of the barnyard and funk character that I'm looking for. They also note that just pitching Brett in the primary also requires a starter to build up a large cell count, sort of a cell count like you would need for pitching a normal yeast. Check out the wiki for more information on that. So two other really common options are either a co-fermentation with Brett. So basically you pitch your normal beer strain and the primary fermentation along with a Brett. And the other option, which we'll see which I'd followed, was doing a primary fermentation with a normal beer yeast. And then once you kind of got toward final gravity, you pitch in the Brett and let it age for a while. So looking at the characteristics of that type of fermentation, as described by Milk the Funk, says if pitched into beer that's already been fermented by Saccharomyces, that's your normal beer strains, or if co-pitched with Saccharomyces, a wider range of flavors, including the funkier flavors, can be produced by changing some of the flavor compounds produced during the Saccharomyces fermentation into other flavor compounds. So note as far as pitch rates, these strategies, either the co-fermentation or the secondary fermentation, require a much smaller pitch of Brett to do the work. So that means I can pitch my single vial of the Brett into my batch. So as I noted, I did a primary fermentation with that bootleg biology Saison Parfait, and then I did a secondary fermentation where I pitched the yeast into that. From what I could tell, maybe that co-pitching strategy may turn over a beer a little faster, but for me, using my glass carboy in the secondary fermentation, well, it seemed like a pretty good option. So that brings up a question. Do you need to use dedicated equipment when you're fermenting with Brett? Well, I've seen mixed information about that. So Brettanomyces, Brett, it's a type of yeast. So in theory, your standard cleaning and sanitation, it should take care of it. Well, one thing though is Brett, it's a pretty hardy yeast. Even a small amount of contamination in a future batch could have a significant impact. So for me, I decided to use my glass carboy, which I'm pretty sure I should be able to clean and sanitize if I want to brew a non-Brett beer in that one. And then I also isolated. I used a stainless steel racking cane and then isolated the other equipment that I used during bottling. So hopefully that would avoid future contamination of beers with the Brett yeast. So I would note another option, and some commercial breweries do this, is pitching Brett at bottling time. So you pitch your Brett into the bottle and then give it time, and in the bottle, the Brett will do the work. Well, the challenge I thought with that was that the Brett's going to break down those sugars and produce carbonation. I really wasn't quite sure in that case how you would predict the carbonation in the bottle. I didn't want to have undercarbonated beers. I didn't want to have bottle bombs. So I didn't go that approach. But what about you? What strategies have you used with Brett? Have you done a co-pitch? Have you done what I've done, the secondary? Have you done it in the bottling? Have you done 100% Brett beer? What suggestions would you have for me to try in a future batch? But getting back to the batch that I brewed with Brett, so 13 days into my primary fermentation, I decided it was time to move on to the next step. So I added my vial of Brett into my glass carboy. Then I transferred the 5-gallon batch of Saison into the carboy. I normally like to give my Saison yeast a little extra time to finish up, make sure it's broken down all the starches and fermented those sugars. But in this case, if the Saison yeast had a little more work to complete, there'd be plenty of time before packaging and secondary fermentation. So one thing I've read about Brett is that the presence of oxygen produces acetic acid. Acetic acid is a primary flavor of vinegar, and it's not really a character that I want in my Brett Saison. So to help avoid this, I flushed the headspace of my carboy with some CO2. I also made sure to select a carboy size with limited headspace. I left the carboy sealed up during primary fermentation to avoid letting oxygen in. So I'm not sure how important that step is. What is your experience? Have you ever had those sort of vinegar flavors in a Brett beer? So after that step, I moved the carboy to an upper level bathroom that's not used very much. This is an interior room, so it stays fairly warm and consistent, with temperatures sort of in that 70, sometimes up to 78 degrees Fahrenheit, or 71 to 26 degrees Celsius range. So checking back in here on day 5, I see signs of slow but steady fermentation. Checking back in at the 4-month mark, I've still been seeing signs of fermentation that's progressing, just slowly. There's a slight pellicle that's formed. Occasionally I see new bubbles that kind of form in the beer, and occasionally I'll see a bubble in the airlock. Then at 7 months, I decided it's a good time for bottling. So at this point, the pellicle is more pronounced. The beer itself has dropped fairly clear. So I decided it'd be easier to set up a bottling station here in my bathroom than move the carboy downstairs and risk stirring up the yeast or even dropping a heavy carboy. My plan is to bottle directly from the fermenter, so I prime each bottle with the needed sugar. I'm just using standard table yeast. It's been a while since I bottled a full 5-gallon batch. This step is a lot easier in my 1-gallon or even my 2.5-gallon batches. To avoid potential contamination, as I mentioned, I'm using my stainless steel racking cane that I can clean and sanitize. The bottling wand, I'm going to set that aside for future Brett brews, or maybe even if I did some sour beers. And the tubing, well, that could be replaced. So I decided to add a small amount of bottling yeast, this CBC1, at bottling time. I think this was a good move. I wanted to ensure I had proper carbonation. So maybe I should have tried a couple bottles without adding the CBC1 just to test for potential differences in carbonation or maybe different Brett character. So what would you suggest for bottling Brett beers? Using a bottling yeast like this CBC1 or just letting it go with Brett? How long would it take to get carbonation? Before I started the bottling process, I did take a gravity reading. So I'm expecting this one to get down really close to 1.0. The gravity before the secondary with Brett was 1008. So in this case, I measure a final gravity of 10,002. So we're pretty close at a good level. That pushes the ABV of this beer up though to a hefty 7.8%. So 7 months from brew day, the beer should be ready to drink, right? Well, we need at least that 2 weeks of carbonation. And I've found that the beer has evolved with character in the bottle. So now we're about another 7 months after that. So about 14 months from brew day. Well, let's go ahead and crack open one of these bottles of yeast. See how it's tasting today. So there's the Brett beer. Oh, I also have a bottle without the Brett. This is my last bottle of this. I'll open that afterwards and see how they compare. But quickly, I can smell some of that funky Brett aroma. Before I give that, so I did put this beer into a couple competitions. Let's take a quick look at some of those judges' results. So my first results were for Dominion Cup 2023. So I scored an overall of a 28, so that's not that great. I usually think about 30 is that kind of crossover between a good example of a style. So some of the comments at that point, where the aroma was spot on, they said it needs to be drier, noticeable sweetness. Brett character was very low, as I said, this one. Could use more Brett flavor. So those are some of the comments I got from that competition. And then about 2 months later, I put it into another local competition. That competition scored an impressive 36, so that's 8 points higher. So I know there's some variation from competition to competition, but that beer, it actually won 3rd place in the category. So I think I got a ribbon for one. That's on my display back there. So the comments from those judges made a little bit more positive. So I got comments, complex flavors and aromas work well together. And one judge says, the Brettanomyces funk flavor dominates and throws the balance off a bit. So I don't know if those 2 months made a huge difference in the character of the beer between one saying the Brett was low and the other saying the Brett was dominant. So in the aroma, I definitely get kind of like a sweet aroma, some fruity, and definitely kind of a little bit of that funky, it's hard to describe. I could see, that barnyard, some kind of like hay. I don't really know what a horse blanket's like, but. So it smells a lot like what I would expect for something like a Brett Farmhouse type beer. Well, let's go in, see how it tastes. Carbonation is definitely lively, it's on the tongue. So I mentioned the beer's evolved in the bottle, especially been a little while since I opened one of these. I have quite a few left. But early on, it definitely had a lot of kind of pineapple and sweetness. And I think maybe some of that was from the judge character early on. Like got that sweetness. Definitely has evolved a little bit more of the kind of leathery character. I don't think it's evolved since a couple months ago. Last time I remember having some of this. I mean, overall, I think this is kind of what I'm looking for. I mean, one thing I say that you don't get a lot of Saison-ish kind of character. You definitely got more. Well, let's go ahead and crack open the Saison without the Brett. I'm a little curious to see how they taste. My initial impression with this one actually tastes a little sweeter than I recall the other one being, even though you dropped the gravity down, so in theory it should be dry. I think that Brett adding that fruity aromas to me gave a sweetness character. Well, we'll see if that's actually what I get when I open the other one. All right, well that one's definitely well carbonated as well. So if we're looking at the two beers, so this one here is the one with the Brett. This is the one without the Brett. I think they look pretty identical. I didn't want to pour more in this glass because I didn't want to stir up yeast, get it all cloudy. So definitely a nice carbonation in both of them. Again, remember this was Saison Parfait from Bootleg Biology. This was Saison Parfait, but added the Brett. Yeah, the aroma is quite different. You definitely get, in the Brett one, you get that Brett character. The Saison Parfait. For being in the bottle as long as it's held up pretty well. It's definitely much more, traditional Saison character. Yeah, I mean, my impressions about the sweetness goes through. I just, in the beer without the Brett, I just get a little bit more bitterness shines through. I get less of that fruity, whereas the Brett one, I really get less bitterness, and then you get those like fruity characters that just kind of hit you as sweet. So it's pretty interesting, that character that you get in the Brett. You definitely get that, a little bit of kind of leathery, a little bit of kind of like a hay, kind of a hay character, I would say, a little funky. But you also get, you know, that sweetness, this sort of tropical fruity, kind of pineapple-y. So have you brewed a beer with Brett before? What was your base beer? What Brett did you use? What strain? What was your process? Well, let me know. And hey, if you like Saisons, I'm always brewing Saisons. I've got videos on my channel, so check those out. And cheers!